city buzzed with anticipation. In the heart of Manhattan, inside the sleek, high-rising studio of one of the most influential news networks in the country, the production team was preparing for what they hoped would be their most explosive interview yet. The host, Rachel Donovan, a renowned journalist known for her sharp tongue and unapologetic style, paced back and forth in her dressing room, mentally rehearsing every calculated question she had prepared. Rachel had built her career on exposing contradictions, pushing boundaries, and leaving no room for hesitation in her interviews. She wasn't just a journalist. She was a force of nature. People either loved her or hated her, but they always watched. And tonight was going to be huge. Her guest, Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, a man whose career spanned decades, who had directed and starred in some of the most iconic films of all time. But he wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol, a representation of old-school masculinity, conservative values, and an era that Rachel had spent her career challenging. She had personally approved the invitation for this interview, not because she admired him, but because she saw an opportunity. Clint Eastwood was an enigma, a man who refused to conform to Hollywood's evolving narrative. While other actors shifted their beliefs to align with the times, he remained unshaken. And that made him the perfect opponent. Rachel had no doubt that the interview would go viral. Her audience expected her to challenge him, to debate him into a corner, to expose how outdated his ideals were in a modern world. She was prepared to tear apart every argument, every anecdote, every word. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Mark, her assistant producer, peeking in. "He's on his way up." Rachel smirked, straightening her blazer. "Perfect." Meanwhile, across the city, a black SUV made its way through the bustling streets. Inside, Clint Eastwood sat in the back seat, calm, composed, and completely unfazed by what was about to unfold. His longtime manager and friend, Tom Branson, sat beside him, scrolling through his phone. "You know they're setting you up, right?" Tom said, glancing at Clint. "This isn't just any interview. Rachel Donovan eats people alive on live television. And you're prime steak." Clint chuckled, adjusting his coat. "Tom, I've been in this business longer than she's been alive. You really think I don't know what I'm walking into?" Tom sighed. "I just don't get why you agreed to this. You don't owe anyone an explanation." Clint looked out the window, watching the city pass by. "I'm not going there to argue. I'm going there to talk. If she listens, great. If she doesn't, well, that's not my problem." Tom shook his head, muttering, "You're either the smartest man I know or the most stubborn." The SUV pulled up to the news studio, and Clint stepped out. A few people outside recognized him, whispering amongst themselves, some pulling out their phones to snap photos. The studio security guided him through the entrance, where a young production assistant quickly greeted him. "Mr. Eastwood," she said nervously, adjusting her headset. "We're so honored to have you here. Right this way." Clint followed her through the hallways, the hustle and tension in the air, something he had experienced thousands of times before. People passed him, some with admiration, others with barely concealed skepticism. He could feel it, the expectation, the challenge. They led him to the green room, where he was offered water and a few moments to relax before the interview. But Clint didn't need preparation. He had lived too much, seen too much, to be rattled by words on a teleprompter. In the studio, Rachel took her position in front of the cameras. The lights were bright, the energy electric. She knew the game better than anyone. This wasn't just an interview. This was a performance. She adjusted her earpiece as her director counted down. 5, 4, 3. Across the building, Clint Eastwood stepped onto the stage. The audience was silent, holding their breath in anticipation. And then, the show began. The studio lights blazed overhead, illuminating the sleek glass table that separated Rachel Donovan from Clint Eastwood. The stage was set. The audience, carefully selected to ensure a mix of perspectives, sat in eager anticipation. Some were die-hard fans of Rachel, ready to watch her dismantle yet another guest. Others were here for Clint, drawn by his legacy, curious to see how he would handle himself against one of the toughest interviewers in the industry. Rachel straightened her posture, offering Clint a carefully measured smile. "Mr. Eastwood, thank you for being here tonight." Clint, seated comfortably, nodded slightly. "Glad to be here." His voice, deep and gravelly with age, carried a quiet authority. He wasn't here to impress anyone. Rachel leaned forward, her fingers laced together on the table. "Let's get straight to it. You've had a long and, some would say, controversial career. Your films have often been criticized for their portrayal of masculinity, law enforcement, and morality. In today's world, many believe your views are outdated. Do you think Hollywood should evolve beyond the type of storytelling you've built your career on?" A subtle shift in the air. The first strike had been made. Clint didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he chuckled. "Hollywood's been evolving since the first reel of film Spawn. That's nothing new." Rachel's smile tightened. "But do you acknowledge that your films often glorify a type of masculinity that many argue is harmful? That they romanticize violence as a solution?" Clint rested his hands on the table. "Violence has been in storytelling since the first caveman drew on a wall. Shakespeare wrote about murder, revenge, war. The Bible has stories of battles, justice, redemption. Do we erase history just because it makes us uncomfortable?" Rachel's jaw tensed slightly. She wasn't used to guests flipping the argument so smoothly. "So, you don't think film has a responsibility to change with the times?" "I think film has a responsibility to tell the truth," Clint said simply. Rachel arched a brow. "And whose truth is that?" "The kind that doesn't change just because it's inconvenient," Clint answered. His voice was steady, unshaken. "People today talk a lot about progress, but progress isn't about erasing what came before. It's about learning from it. We don't burn books because they reflect a time with different values. We study them, we discuss them, we understand." A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. Some nodded in agreement. Others exchanged glances, unsure of how to process what they were hearing. Rachel, always composed, leaned back slightly. "Interesting perspective, but let's talk about something more personal. You've been vocal in your political views, and not always in alignment with mainstream Hollywood. Many have accused you of being out of touch with today's social issues. Do you think that's a fair assessment?" Clint smiled. "Fair? No. Expected?" Rachel's lips parted slightly, momentarily thrown by the lack of defensiveness. Clint continued, "I grew up in a different time, that's true. I've seen the world change in ways people today wouldn't believe. But the thing about time is, it doesn't make you out of touch. It makes you aware. You live long enough, you start to notice patterns. The way people get caught up in movements without stopping to ask themselves why. The way history repeats itself when no one's paying attention." Rachel adjusted in her seat. "And you think that's happening now?" Clint shrugged. "It's always happening. People think they're breaking new ground when they're just walking in circles." The tension in the room was palpable. Rachel had expected Clint to be defensive, to try to justify himself. Instead, he was teaching. And worse, people were listening. She decided to pivot. "So, when you say you believe in learning from the past, does that mean you reject modern social movements? The push for inclusivity, equality, and representation?" Clint exhaled slowly. "I believe in equality. I believe in fairness. But fairness means letting everyone have a voice, even the ones you don't agree with. The moment you start silencing people because they don't fit the current narrative, you're not making progress. You're making a new kind of oppression." The audience shifted. Some clapped. Others sat still, absorbing his words. Rachel tapped her pen against the table. "That's a bold statement." Clint smirked. "You invited me here to be honest, didn't you?" Rachel held his gaze. She wasn't sure who was winning this exchange anymore. She had come prepared to dismantle him, but Clint wasn't fighting. He was simply existing in his truth, and that was somehow more powerful than she had anticipated. She glanced down at her notes, considering her next move. "Let's talk about legacy, then. You've built an empire in Hollywood, but do you ever worry that history will look back on your work and judge it differently than you intended?" Clint's smile was small, knowing. History always judges differently. That's its job. Rachel's grip on her pen tightened. "And that doesn't concern you?" "No," Clint said plainly. "Because I didn't make movies to be liked. I made them to be real. And reality doesn't ask for approval." Silence. Rachel could feel the energy in the room shift again. This wasn't going the way she had planned. Clint wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He wasn't stubbornly clinging to outdated ideals. He was just certain. She set her pen down, studying him. "You don't care what people think, do you?" Clint chuckled, his eyes twinkling with something resembling amusement. "Rachel, I've been alive for nearly a century. Do you really think I have time to worry about that?" The audience laughed. Rachel smirked despite herself. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she was debating an opponent or learning from a mentor. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure which outcome she preferred. Rachel Donovan could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had expected resistance, defensiveness, maybe even a moment where Clint Eastwood lost his composure. Instead, he had remained calm, composed, and unwavering in his beliefs, and somehow that was more disarming than anything else. The audience, once expecting a fiery debate, now seemed genuinely captivated. Some leaned forward in their seats, others exchanged glances, but all were listening. Rachel took a slow breath, adjusting her posture. She wasn't about to lose control of the conversation. She glanced at her notes, quickly scanning for a point she could press harder. And then she found it. "Let's talk about privilege," she said, her voice smooth but edged with challenge. "You've had an incredible career. Fame, wealth, success. You've been given opportunities that many will never have. How do you respond to people who say that your perspective, your version of truth, is shaped by privilege? That maybe you don't fully understand the struggles of those who weren't born into opportunity?" A few murmurs from the audience, a calculated move. Clint leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers against the table as if considering her words. Then, with that same measured calm, he spoke. "Privilege is an interesting word," he mused. "People throw it around a lot these days, as if success is something that just falls into your lap." Rachel tilted her head. "Are you saying you don't believe privilege exists?" Clint let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, I know it exists, but what I don't believe is that it tells the whole story." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing an opportunity to press forward. "Explain." Clint exhaled slowly, glancing toward the audience before turning back to her. "I grew up during the Great Depression. My family didn't have much. We moved around a lot, never staying in one place for too long. I worked odd jobs, digging ditches, stacking hay, anything to make a few bucks. I didn't have a trust fund. I didn't have connections. And when I got to Hollywood, no one was handing out opportunities." Rachel opened her mouth, but Clint wasn't done. "You know what I did?" he continued. "I worked. I failed. I got told no more times than I can count. I took roles that paid almost nothing just to get my foot in the door. And eventually, after years of rejection, I got a break. And even then I had to fight to prove I deserved to be there." Rachel's expression remained composed, but the room had fallen completely silent. Clint leaned forward slightly, So when people say, I had privilege, I ask them, what part? The part where I had to sleep in my car between auditions? The part where I almost gave up more times than I can remember? Or the part where I refused to let failure define me? A ripple of muffled reactions from the audience, some nodding, others still digesting his words. Rachel recovered quickly. But surely you recognize that being a white man in Hollywood, especially during your early career, gave you advantages that others didn't have. Clint nodded. Of course, I'd be a fool not to. But that doesn't mean I didn't earn what I have, and it doesn't mean that anyone, no matter where they come from, can't do the same. Rachel folded her hands on the table. So you believe success is purely about effort? Clint shrugged. No, life's not fair, Rachel. It never has been. Some people get a head start, some don't. That's reality. But I also believe this. You can sit around complaining about the disadvantages, or you can get up and do something about it. A wave of reactions rippled through the audience. Some clapped, others whispered to each other. Rachel exhaled slowly. That's easy to say when you're sitting where you are. Clint met her gaze, unshaken. It's easy to say, because I've lived it. The silence stretched for a moment, the weight of his words settling over the studio. Rachel shifted tactics. All right, let's talk about your legacy. You've spent decades in Hollywood, shaping what many consider to be a classic American ideal. But as the industry evolves, do you worry that history will look back and see your work as outdated, even problematic? Clint smirked. History always finds something to be offended by. The audience chuckled. Rachel arched a brow. So you don't think art should change with the times? Clint shook his head. Art reflects its time. If you go back and judge yesterday's stories by today's standards, you miss the point entirely. Rachel leaned in. What if today's standards say those stories were harmful? Clint held her gaze. Then maybe today's standards need to learn how to respect the past instead of trying to erase it. Another pause. The audience was hanging on every word. Rachel could feel it. The conversation had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. She had walked into this interview expecting to dismantle him, to expose the flaws in his worldview. But Clint wasn't fighting her. He was making her think. She wasn't used to this. She adjusted her posture. So, you don't regret anything? No film, no role, no statement you've made? Clint shook his head. Regret? No. Reflection? Always. Rachel blinked, thrown by the distinction. Meaning? Clint took a sip of water before answering. I've made mistakes. I've learned from them. But I don't waste time regretting them, because every mistake is part of what made me who I am. You don't grow by pretending the past didn't happen. You grow by learning from it. The audience erupted into applause. Rachel was silent for a moment. She wasn't sure if she had won or lost this exchange. Maybe neither of them had. She straightened her notes. All right, one final question. Clint gestured for her to continue. If you could give one piece of advice to the next generation, filmmakers, leaders, anyone looking to make an impact, what would it be? Clint smiled, a rare warmth in his expression. Don't chase approval. Don't apologize for who you are. Stand by what you believe, even when it's unpopular. And most importantly, he paused. Learn to listen before you speak. Rachel exhaled sharply. She had spent her career leading conversations, controlling the narrative. But tonight, she had been taught a lesson. The interview was over. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who had learned more. The applause in the studio finally began to fade, but the atmosphere remained charged. Rachel Donovan, who had built her career on dominating conversations, found herself in an unfamiliar position. reflecting rather than countering. She glanced at the producers behind the cameras. They were waiting for her to wrap up, expecting a strong closing statement. A final punch, a definitive moment where she reclaimed control. But as she looked at Clint Eastwood, still sitting comfortably across from her, she realized something. She didn't want to fight. She wanted to understand. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to him. "I'll be honest with you, Clint. This interview hasn't gone the way I expected." Clint smirked, leaning back in his chair. "How's that?" Rachel tapped her fingers against the table. "I came prepared for a debate. I thought we'd spend the hour going back and forth, challenging each other. But instead," she hesitated, "instead, I feel like I've just had a conversation with someone who's spent a lifetime watching the world change." Clint nodded slightly. "That's because I have, huh?" Rachel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "You're not easy to rattle, are you?" Clint chuckled. "Not anymore." A beat of silence passed between them, the weight of the discussion settling. Rachel could sense the audience was still engaged, still listening. This wasn't just another interview. It had become something more. She exhaled. "All right, before we wrap up, I want to ask you something different. Not about Hollywood. Not about politics. Just about life." Clint folded his arms, waiting. Rachel leaned forward. "What's the biggest lesson you've learned?" Clint didn't hesitate. That people spend too much time trying to be liked. Rachel blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Clint tilted his head slightly, as if deciding how to explain it. "Most people live their lives afraid of stepping on toes. They're afraid to say the wrong thing, to hold the wrong opinion, to be seen as different. But the truth is, the moment you start living for approval, you stop living for yourself." Rachel sat back, letting his words sink in. Clint continued, his voice steady. "When I was younger, I cared too much about what people thought, wanted to prove myself, wanted to be accepted, and then, one day, I realized something. The people who really make a difference in the world aren't the ones trying to be liked. They're the ones who stand for something, even when it's not easy." Rachel studied him for a long moment. She had spent her entire career challenging others, pushing them to defend their positions. But right now she wasn't thinking about how to counter his words. She was thinking about what they meant for her. Clearing her throat, she shifted in her chair. "So, if you had to give one piece of advice to young people watching this, people trying to figure out who they are, what they believe in, what would it be?" Clint gave a small, knowing smile. "Stop looking for permission to be yourself." Rachel's fingers curled slightly against the table. Clint's voice softened, but the conviction remained. "The world will always try to tell you what to believe, what to say, how to act, and if you let it, you'll wake up one day and realize you've spent your whole life being someone else. So don't wait for the world's approval. Make your own path." The audience was silent, completely silent. Rachel swallowed. For the first time in a long time, she had no immediate response, no clever retort, no quick transition. Because Clint Eastwood had just spoken a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She looked down at her notes, then back up at him. "That's powerful." Clint nodded as if to say, "It's not complicated, it's just true." Rachel exhaled, then turned to the camera, her professional instincts kicking back in. "Well, I think we can all agree that this has been one of the most insightful conversations we've had on this show." She turned back to Clint. "Thank you for being here tonight." Clint smiled slightly. "Thanks for having me." The cameras cut, the studio lights dimmed slightly, and for the first time in her entire career, Rachel didn't immediately rush to check the audience reactions or prepare for the next segment. Instead, she just sat there, thinking. And as Clint Eastwood stood up, Adjusting his jacket, he glanced at her one last time. "Take care of yourself, Rachel." She met his gaze. "You too, Clint." And as he walked off the stage, she realized something unexpected. She had invited Clint Eastwood onto her show to challenge him. But in the end, he had been the one to challenge her. The interview had ended, but the impact lingered. The studio, usually buzzing with post-show analysis, was eerily quiet as Rachel Donovan sat at her desk, staring at the dimming lights overhead. Clint Eastwood had walked off set minutes ago, yet his words still echoed in her mind. She had spent years sharpening her ability to challenge, to push, to expose contradictions. Yet tonight, for the first time, she wasn't thinking about how she had performed. She was thinking about what she had learned. Her producer, Mark, approached cautiously. "Rachel, that was different." She blinked, pulled from her thoughts. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "You usually take control, drive the conversation, but this time," he exhaled, "this time, it felt like you were the one being challenged." Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yeah," she admitted. "It did." She expected Mark to follow up with some analysis about how they could have steered the discussion differently, how they could have gotten more viral sound bites, but instead he simply nodded. "It was good," he said. "Really good." Rachel glanced at the production monitors, where a replay of the interview was already running. Clint's calm, unshaken demeanor, his refusal to be baited into soundbite-weighty outrage, his unwavering belief in personal integrity. She turned back to Mark. "How's the audience reacting?" Mark checked his phone, scrolling through early reactions on social media. His eyebrows lifted. "Well, this is interesting." Rachel leaned in. "What?" He handed her the phone. "See for yourself." She took it, scanning the flood of comments beneath the live-streamed interview. Instead of the usual heated debates or partisan outrage, there was something else. Respect. This is what a real conversation looks like. No shouting, no nonsense, just two people talking. "I may not agree with Clint Eastwood on everything, but damn, he makes you think." Rachel looked like she was expecting to destroy him, but instead she actually listened. That's rare these days. Her grip on the phone tightened. She scrolled further. "Clint's right. We spend too much time trying to be liked instead of being ourselves. I walked into this thinking I was going to root for Rachel and dunk on Clint, but now I'm sitting here reevaluating my whole perspective on life." Rachel set the phone down, running a hand through her hair. "This isn't what I expected." Mark smirked. "Guess you're not the only one Clint made think tonight." She let out a dry laugh. "Apparently not." A few more producers walked in, their expressions expectant. Rachel knew they wanted to discuss the show's direction, how they could follow up, how they could frame the post-interview narrative. But for once, she wasn't interested in spin. She looked at them, then at Mark. "I need a minute." Mark nodded. "Take your time." As they filed out, Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the blank screen where Clint's face had been just moments ago. She thought back to one of his final statements. Stop looking for permission to be yourself. How many times had she held back her own thoughts, her own doubts, in favor of fitting the mold expected of her? How often had she played the role of hard-hitting journalist, focusing more on the performance than the actual conversation? For years she had been certain that her job was to challenge others, but now, she wondered, when was the last time she had challenged herself? The weight of that realization settled deep in her chest. With a slow exhale, she picked up her phone again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she typed a simple tweet. "Tonight, I didn't just interview Clint Eastwood. I learned from him. And maybe we all should." She hit send. Almost immediately, responses poured in. Respect. That's how you grow. Didn't think I'd ever see Rachel admit that. Clint really is something else. This is why real conversations matter. Not everything has to be a battle. Rachel stared at the screen, then put the phone down. She didn't know what tomorrow's headlines would say. She didn't know how this would affect her reputation, her audience, or her network's next move. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't care. Because tonight, she had done something she hadn't done in years. She had listened. And somehow, she knew that was the real victory.
This story reminds us that real conversations aren't about winning or losing. They're about listening, learning, and challenging our own perspectives. Too often, we enter discussions with a mindset of defense, ready to prove a point rather than understand one. But the most powerful moments in life don't come from proving others wrong. They come from realizing Clint Eastwood didn't step into that interview to fight. He stepped in to speak his truth. And in doing so, he didn't just change the conversation, he changed Rachel Donovan. She walked in expecting a battle, but she walked out with something far more valuable, a lesson in humility, wisdom, and self reflection. In today's world where debates turn into shouting matches and disagreements lead to division, maybe what we need isn't more people trying to win arguments. Maybe what we need is more people willing to listen, to reflect, and to seek understanding over validation. At the end of the day, the strongest voices don't belong to those who shout the loudest. They belong to those who stand firm in their beliefs while still making room to grow. What do you think? Have you ever had a conversation that completely changed your perspective? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found today's topic intriguing, comment 1 below. If it didn't resonate, comment 0. Your feedback helps us create videos that matter to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.